couldn't help but think of Joy Mills, because she said, temperature control. She was either too cold or too hot, so always setting the...
Since you have mentioned Joy Mills, one of her comments she made actually at a national conference of TS, Theosophical Society of America. She said, when people die naturally, Saint Patrick has to decide whether they go to heaven or hell. So most people, Saint Peter, sorry, I said Patrick, Saint Peter. So people then, depending, based on what they have done in life, they are given some choice. And she said, when a theosophist goes there, of course they have been good people, so they can go to heaven, but Saint Peter says to them, you can choose. Do you wish to go to heaven, or do you wish to go to a seminar about heaven? And she said the theosophist will choose the seminar about heaven. This was Joy Mills, that's not my remark.
That's us, yeah.
I guess we are not expecting other people, so shall I begin? Is it time?
Well, but Fridays, a lot of people come, no? Or
they might come late.
Well, since particularly this book is being displayed here, the Yoga of the Christ, if you don't mind, I'll tell you a little story about, not only about this book, but my introduction to trying to understand something about Christianity. I came to Canada in 1961 to do a PhD in physics. So I was at the University of Toronto, and there was an organization there. For me, in any case, it seemed completely obvious that every culture is very much influenced by its major religion, whether they like it or not, but they have holidays at Christmas and at Easter. Kids listen to those mythological stories. So it seemed to me completely obvious that I should learn something about Christianity, since that was obviously the religion. Now, being in the physics department, you can well imagine the students there thought being interested in religion is just crazy. These are physics graduate students, right? So from their point of view, in fact, on one occasion, I overheard somebody say to another student, well, he's from India. That meant he could be crazy. He's from India. And especially at that time, there were not as many people from India coming to Canada as has. This is 1961, is not yesterday, it was a long time ago. There was a particular organization called Varsity Christian Fellowship, and they were very eager to convert me to Christianity. And being a young man of 23 years old, and some of these young ladies offering many, I won't go into details of that, because convincing me that unless I become a Christian, I will go to hell. So they tried quite hard, but one of the things that was a great advantage I received from that, they gave me a copy of the New Testament for me to study. And so I tried to look at it as carefully as I could, and I was very struck by the Gospel of John, much more than any other gospel, personally. Later on, I discovered that even within the Christian tradition, that has been considered since the 2nd century as the most spiritual gospel among the gospels. And of course, sooner or later, I left the Varsity Christian Fellowship. That wasn't really particularly engaging me. And so whenever I would speak to any of my nominally Christian friends, they were all Christian basically. Everybody in Canada calls themselves Christian. But they go to church only either at funerals or at marriages. Those are the only two times. That's what happens everywhere. And so don't take my word so literal-mindedly, but if you have any really radically different understanding of this, do correct me. So whenever I would speak to any of these so-called Christian friends, what was striking in the gospel, they would, but that's not there, they would say. That's not there. So I would sometimes point out. And it was really because of all that, gradually, finally, somebody or the other said, well, what you are looking at the gospel is completely differently from what we see generally, so you should publish it. Until that time, it had never crossed my mind to actually publish anything. I mean, I don't regard myself as an author or any such thing. I mean, I'm just an ordinary researcher.
10 books.
Hmm?
At least 10 books that he's done.
No, but none of them have arisen because I'm a writer. I mean, I'm just searching for something, I'm trying to understand something. And somebody or the other says, but that's not what the usual understanding is, so that then it gets published. But in any case, finally we decided to publish it, and I sent it to several publishers in USA, 5 or 6 of them, and I got the standard response. It doesn't fit into our publishing program. But 2 chief editors of 2 well-known publishing houses wrote to me private letters saying they were absolutely touched and moved by it, but they cannot persuade their people who are usually concerned with how many books they will sell. Because I later discovered, I did not know this earlier, that apparently no non-Christian had ever written a commentary on John's Gospel. I was surprised by this, but this is not my remark. This is a well-known Christian scholar who told me this. Christians are happily writing about everybody else's books, but in any case, but my mentor at that time in the Gurdjieff teaching was Mrs. Welch, and she said, she is an American, but she said, these American publishers, they don't write anything. So she found somebody in England to publish this book. This was initially published in England in 1990. And what is surprising that within 1 month of its publication, I get a letter from the well-known publishing house in France. Can they translate this into French? Until that time, nobody wanted to publish it. And soon after, this has been published into at least a dozen languages. The last publication of it was in Hungarian hardly 6 months ago, in Hungarian. So I mention this that in a way, nobody was interested in publishing it, but once it got published, so many publishers are getting, it's been published in practically every European language in one way or the other. And here I also remind you, I chose the title, The Yoga of the Christ, because the word yoga can mean many things. It can mean a way, a method. So from my point of view, it was the way of Christ. In fact, the subtitle of that is The Way to the Center. But the Greek publisher, who was eager to publish it, sent me a letter saying if they use the word yoga and Christ in the same title, the church will burn their publishing house down. So they changed the title to something like Symbolism in the Gospel of John. In fact, even in USA, they did not want to use the word the yoga of the Christ. They published initially as Christ the Yogi. And my son was at that time just practicing or studying law. He says we should sue them. A young lawyer, very keen to sue the publishing house. But since I objected to it very much, they said once they sell the present publication, then they will change the title. Then they changed the title to The Gospel of John in the Light of Indian Mysticism. That's the title you see there. That's published in USA. But only the Theosophical Publishing House in India was happy to use the original title. So this particular book was published again in India as The Yoga of the Christ. I mention this because many of my friends, not necessarily friends, somehow have felt that this connects them with slightly deeper aspects of Christianity. In fact, a cardinal in the Vatican, Echegaray, he read this in French, wrote to me especially about this. And the Bishop of London, who officiates on all these royal weddings, he actually said it came as a breath of fresh air. Then he says, but I don't agree with everything you say, which is fine. So I'm simply telling you that in a way, I'm looking at it clearly from a different perspective than usual Christians look at it. And many, many people have told me, and this friend of mine can tell you this, he's a minister in the church, he feels more connected with Christianity because of this book. Because from my point of view, Christ is a very great teacher, and so I'm really more interested in the subtlety of his teaching rather than I should believe this or should not believe that kind of. And just more or less to conclude that, somebody from England sent me that, I think it was in 1982 or 83, I actually mentioned this in my book, The Blessed by Mysterious Grace. In the church in the Piccadilly Square, the minister said, if you are condemned to be on an island but can take with you one book or one DVD or something, what would you take? And there is a picture of a lady who looks about 70 years old, Angela Dance. I have never met her, but she is my greatest reviewer of this book. That's why I'm mentioning this. So she says, it's written there in the Piccadilly, I think it's St. George Church in Piccadilly Square. She says, well, because I've been coming to the church, I've been reading the Bible has been really much more inspiring me, so naturally I would like to take the Bible with me. But when it comes to the book by Ravindra, I'm not sure which one I will take. Now here, this is my best review of that book. So next year when I went to England, I'm often invited to speak there, Tamnos Academy particularly. So I asked them to invite her as my guest. She had passed away. So I have never met her. I have no idea who she was. She's obviously not an academic type. Academics always have to argue about something or the other. For example, one of the academic reviewers said, I'm mixing the water of Ganga with the water of River Jordan. So in the next version of this, because it's been published now many times, and so I point out that, sure, if you are going by a camel near the River Jordan or in a bullock cart by the River Ganga, you have a very different perspective. But if you happen to fly over both Jordan and Ganga, you have a different perspective. But you see, from his point of view, I'm mixing the water of Ganga with the water of Jordan. So I draw your attention to this because partly it doesn't matter that one may say, or you people may say, oh, I'm not a Christian. This culture cannot not be influenced by Christianity. I think I mentioned this the other day. A great writer, Northrop Frye, writing this book called The Sacred Code, in which he speaks about all the European languages have been very much influenced by the Bible. It could hardly be otherwise. And Theosophical Society, in any case, most of the teaching of the society is a very subtle combination of something coming from the Indian tradition and from the Christian tradition. All the major people in Theosophical Society were from Christian background. Annie Besant, HPB, Leadbeater, name any of them. They're all Alcott, they're all coming from the Christian background. So I invite you to take Christianity seriously, but not the superficiality of it, which is what goes on in the churches. Deep down, what is the teaching of Christ? That has been my own wish to try to understand. And same thing, I would invite you to study the Bhagavad Gita or the Yoga Sutras with the same kind of attitude, not just to accept something just because that gets said in the temples. It's the same thing goes on there as it goes on here. But let's now really proceed more to. I will more, although we are speaking generally about the whole Abrahamic traditions, meaning what gets called Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but I will largely focus on Christianity, partly because it is the largest religion in the world. Nearly 3 billion people on the planet call themselves Christians. And in any case, as I reminded yesterday also, Christ was a Jew, as were all his disciples. And he says, I'm fulfilling the tradition. That is the tradition he's fulfilling. It's not any other tradition. But the reason I'm quoting this here, because one takes an overall perspective, but there are many, many varieties, many variations within Christianity itself. For example, if you talk to some of the Orthodox Church Christians, they think what the Catholics are saying is just crazy. Or the Protestants and Catholics break away from each other. So in a way, to say this is a Christian point of view is not so easy. That's why I'm quoting to you here this remark of William Blake. The vision of Christ that thou dost see is my vision's greatest enemy. Thine has a great hook nose like thine. Mine has a snub nose like to mine. You can see, for example, if you see the portraits of the Buddha in Japan, they look very Japanese. Nobody would disagree that he came from India. And especially to see a fat belly Buddha, you can see this only in the Chinese representation. It's absolutely impossible to see that in any portrait in India. Actually, most of the Indian portraits, especially from Sarnath in the 6th or 7th century, you can practically see his backbone from the front. He's so emaciated. So, but in China, it's prosperity and internal wisdom are coupled together often. So therefore, naturally, the kings are regarded as the heirs of wisdom, traditional spiritual wisdom. Same thing, something like that is also true in England, but to a lesser degree. It's more so in China. Whereas in India, if a priest went to the court of a king, the king will stand up and will touch his feet. So there is a complete separation between the people who are containing wisdom, spiritual wisdom, and people who are rulers. Occasionally there may be a combination. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna actually mentions Janaka, one of the kings, who he regards as having encountered both sides. But in general, in China, very strong tendency that the king is the wisest person. And therefore, of course, eating well, etc., etc. So the portrait of the Buddha can be with fat belly, which will completely surprise anybody in India. Historically, in Christianity, there has been a very strong link between religious power and secular power. In deciding the churchly doctrines, there were many disputes, and finally various councils accepted certain dogmas. The first 4 councils which Christians of all stripes accept were not called by the Pope nor attended by the Pope. They were initiated by Emperor Constantine and his successor kings. You probably all know this, that in the 4th century, Constantine, the emperor, happened to somehow see something in the sky, like a cross. So he became a Christian. And you can read any scholar writing about the history of Europe. These are not my remarks. Until that time, it was dangerous to be a Christian in Europe. After that, it was dangerous not to be a Christian in Europe. But that is all coming from the emperor. It's not coming from the spiritual side or the religious side. The next 3 councils were attended by Pope's representative, not by the Pope himself. Opposing or different views were set aside, and their proponents were either imprisoned or killed. You may wish to read, Elaine Pagel was a professor of religion at Yale University. She's passed away now. She wrote a book called The Gnostic Gospels to learn how the council creeds were determined. You had raised a question about Gnostic Gospels the other day in passing. Oh, you had, sorry. Yeah. Gnostic Gospels are really much more, even the very word Gnostic, it comes from gnosis, which is the same root as the Sanskrit word jnana, knowledge. Because in the whole of the Indian tradition, the main obstacle is ignorance. Whereas in the whole of the Christian tradition, the main obstacle is lack of faith. So it's a very different focus altogether. And the Gnostic Gospels, the very reason why they're called Gnostic, is because they're also focusing on subtler and subtler knowledge. And the proponents of those Gospels were either actually killed, or if they are coming in ships, their ships were drowned. You don't take my word for it. You can read the book by Elaine Pagels. In the introduction she shows. And these Gnostic Gospels were buried or burned. They were discovered only in 1949, not 2,000 years ago or 1949. And they are still gradually being translated, and there are sometimes differences in translation because some pages are missing or some lines have been cleared or something has happened. In fact, on one occasion, this was a little earlier, I think it was in 1899 or somebody in Egypt is sitting in a cave, is feeling cold at night. People often forget in the deserts it can be very cold at night, although very hot in the day. So just trying to warm himself, he happens to find some papers lying around, so he puts it on fire. It turns out to be ancient classical Gnostic gospel, some of them, which is just burning to heat himself, to warm himself. The perspective of most of the Christian churches is based on the creeds in the first 7 councils. That's the reason I'm mentioning it here. It does not correspond with the views of any mystic in Christianity, such as Jesus Christ, St. Paul, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Meister Eckhart, or Angelus Silesius, or with the perspectives in the experience-based texts, such as Imitatio Christi, Theologia Germanica, The Cloud of Unknowing, or Philokalia. You don't need to take my word for it. You can read any of these books or read what any of these searchers themselves said. None of this corresponds to any of these creeds. None of these creeds are in the Bible. They just all determined 4 years later because the king just wants to get ahead and rule and just want you to believe this and this and that. So that's the reason I'm mentioning this. The Christian era begins with the first council of Nicaea in AD 325, 4th century, and it is convened by Emperor Constantine following his victory over Lycinius and consolidation of his reign over the Roman Empire. Nicaea I enunciated the Nicene Creed that is in its original form and modified by the First Council of Constantinople, was seen by all later councils as the touchstone of orthodoxy on the doctrine of the Trinity. The Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches accept all 7 of these councils as legitimate ecumenical councils. That's the reason I'm just mentioning this. So word of these, what is called Christianity is these are the creeds. You believe these, and as a kid when you want to be baptized, you have to say, I agree with this. You're hardly out of diapers, but you have to say all this. This is organized religions of necessity have to appeal to the masses. So they get organized around a special person or a special event or a special doctrine. Then the organization has to insist that what they are bringing is the exclusive avenue to God or truth or salvation. Other organizations may be tolerated, but they are not as excellent as our organization or religion. In Roman Catholicism, for example, it is insisted that extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside the church, there is no salvation. Every kid has to say that to become a Catholic. Now, how do they know this? But, I mean, how does a kid know this? But so, in this book of mine, Whisper from the Other Shore, Spiritual Search East and West, I try to find out some of, or I think I mentioned this the other day as well, some of the major differences in the approach to religious notions and religious practices coming from the eastern side and from the western side. In this book, I'm not really referring to Islam, nor particularly to Jainism or Sikhism, but mostly Hinduism and Buddhism from the Indian side, Judaism and Christianity from the Western side. Key words in the two major traditions. I'm here very much trying to shorten the whole thing. In the Christian tradition, you would find these words: sin, faith, prayer, salvation, and Christ is the Savior. In the Indian tradition, you would find these other words. I'm giving them in Sanskrit, but also translating them: ignorance, knowledge, practice, liberation. Buddha or Krishna are teachers or models, not saviors. That doesn't mean, I think I probably 2 or 3 days ago also said, that doesn't mean there is any lack of sin in India. 40% of elected members of parliament in India have criminal records against them. So basically the emphasis is not that we are sinful right from birth and therefore need to be saved. And the word faith, for many scholars, actually became more or less synonymous with the word religion. In fact, a very well-known scholar, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, he's now passed away. He was the founder of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard, so clearly hardly a negligible scholar. He wrote a book called Faith of Other Men, by which he later on, actually about a decade later, he republished that book under a different title called Religions of Other Men. So for the word faith has become more or less synonymous with religion in the Christian tradition, which will be completely surprising from the perspective of anybody coming from India. All of these words, we obviously now have to use them in English, but one has to be very careful. I mentioned this other day that really the appropriate translation of religion into Sanskrit will be closer to yoga than to dharma, but it usually gets translated as dharma. It is through, here I'm just quoting here, it is through faith that we are saved, and then whatever is not of faith is sin, says St. Paul. The distinctive characteristic of the biblical religion is not direct knowledge, but faith. Above all, human beings, the creatures, must realize their nothingness compared to the majesty of God. Here I quote from the Psalms, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Actually, it was the Bishop of London who said to me, they should change the word, rather than saying the house of the Lord, they should say the house of lords. I tell you a little story here, because he actually asked me if I wanted to see the House of Lords in London. He was very struck by my book, so he asked me if I come to London, can I come and see him? So I went to see him. And you probably know there are 3 people who ex officio are members of the House of Lords. One is the Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop of York, and the Bishop of London. Whosoever they are, they automatically become members of the House of the Lord. So he was obviously a member of the House of the Lord, so he could take me there to show me. And one thing that especially struck me there were only 2, there were, I can't tell you the exact number, probably about 50. These are the members of the House of the Lord. 2 chairs had arms around them, only 2 chairs. And I was very surprised. I said to him, why? He said, this is not meant to be too public an idea. But what they discovered at the end of the 19th century, that the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York were always too drunk to sit properly. So this is the Bishop of London telling me this, take my word for it. So they had to put the arms on those chairs. What goes on in the name of religion? Bishop, I don't think, he's no longer now the Bishop of London, he's been replaced. But then we have this remark of St. Paul in the Galatians, don't be under any illusion. You cannot make a fool of God. A man's harvest in life will depend entirely on what he sows. If he sows for his own lower nature, his harvest will be the decay and death of his own nature. But if he sows for the Spirit, he will reap the harvest of everlasting life by that Spirit. Let us not grow tired of doing good, for unless we throw in our hand, the ultimate harvest is assured. Let us then do good to all men as opportunity offers. And then I was surprised to see the next remark, especially to those who belong to the Christian household. Don't take my word for it, you can read it in the Gospel. You can take this reference and check it. So. The God of judgment punishes all those who disobey him. Disobedience is a breach of faith, for the primary meaning of faith, both in the Old and the New Testament, is obedience. This is, by the way, the reason why, more emphasized in the Catholic Church than anywhere else, that right at birth we become sinful because we are children of Adam and Eve, and Adam had disobeyed God, who asked him not to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And this is why he was then expelled from the Garden of Eden. Quite a well-known Christian theologian actually wrote a book slightly questioning this. He wrote a book called Original Blessing, and he was excommunicated from the church. Personally, I invite you, in fact I have more than once already probably quoted it without giving the reference, 2nd chapter in the book of Genesis, 7th verse. I think I have quoted it here, saying that God breathed his own breath into us to keep us alive. So it's the breath of God that is keeping us alive. So to imagine that it is all we are so completely sinful right from the birth is a different interpretation. My own impression is, just imagine if Adam and Eve were just hanging around in the Garden of Eden. How long do you want to hang around with each other? Doing nothing. Personally, I think what is called expulsion from the Garden of Eden is in fact sending him outside to take care of the world. It's a very different understanding or different interpretation. So I invite you to reconsider the whole thing there about why is he expelled? Because he has eaten the fruit of tree of knowledge. So if he's got some knowledge, now he wants to do something useful. Should he be punished because he had some knowledge? Now this surprises me as a whole idea behind this. But okay, so then Ecclesiastes, this is the end of the matter. You have heard it all. Fear God and obey his commands. There is no more to man than this, for God brings everything we do to judgment, and every secret, whether good or bad. Immortality of the soul and the requirement of the grace of God through Jesus Christ and through the scriptures and the church very much activates the need and the wish for faith. And owing to the notion there is only one birth, the notion of everlasting judgment emerges. One will be everlastingly in heaven or in hell. None of this is actually in the Bible. But all of this gradually emerges in the Christian tradition. And then Last Judgment by Michelangelo. Might interest you. This is right in the heart of the Catholic Church place in the Vatican, in the Sistine Chapel. And I should also remind you here, in fact I will show you quickly just 3 or 4 paintings from the medieval times. They were not very interested in painting heaven because nothing interesting is taking place there. Just the angels are going around playing harp. So what do you do with that? But for them, hell was very much more interesting. You can well imagine. So here, I give you the dates there. 1306, 1440, hardly any paintings of heaven, but many more of hell, 1504. Now, in the 20th century, somebody had painted heavens. Actually, if you look at it carefully, we don't have enough time for that. You see what is now understood to be what leads to happiness. Some naked ladies breathing, swimming there. So, what goes on in the name of religion? Okay. Even the generally moderate and judicial temper of Thomas Aquinas did not prevent him endorsing the view, by then widely held, that the blessed in heaven will be granted a perfect view of the punishment of the damned and will have no pity on them. Indeed, the punishment of the damned will be an indirect result of the joy of the blessed. Can you believe this? This Thomas Aquinas saying this. To see the suffering of the condemned will give you pleasure in heaven. I can hardly believe any of this, but that's... So, immediate judgment at death relates to the quality of one's life on earth. The last judgment will be at the second coming of Christ, when there will be a battle between God and the devil will be defeated, and the whole humanity will be judged. A tension between the two judgments, namely judgment at death and then the final judgment at the end, a tension between the two judgments led to the idea of limbo and purgatory. The Eastern Orthodox Church has no doctrine of purgatory. The presupposition of the doctrine of purgatory is that there is a special judgment for each individual at once after death, but one can change and move towards the possibility of good life. Life in purgatory ceases with the last judgment. Then one will be either in hell or in heaven forever. But one will remain the unique individual. I think I mentioned that earlier. That is one of the fundamental distinctions between the overall Indian perspective on the oneness of all and the uniqueness of each individual. Even after death, in perpetuity, in everlastingly, one will be a unique individual. Maybe in hell or maybe in heaven, but one will be unique. Then I specially actually invite you, Encyclopedia Britannica, which is hardly, this scholar, actually the scholar at Yale University, professor of religion, has written this article. This is what he says: the idea of the last judgment has often become incomprehensible to the modern world. At the most, people apparently are still open to the concept of judgment of the guilt and innocence of the individual. For the most part, the churches of the early part of the 21st century no longer have the courage to uphold the Christian teaching of life after death. I have 2 or 3 quotations from him. Since the period of Romanticism and idealism, ideas of the transmigration of souls and reincarnation, taken over from Hinduism and Buddhism, have gained a footing in Christian views of the end of time expectation. Some important impulses towards a new understanding of the view of life after death are found in Christian theosophy. That's his expression. Such as the idea of a further development of the human personality upon other celestial bodies after death. I could read Annie Besant's book that I mentioned here, Life After Death. No, Death and After. More and more Christians are moving away from this view of eternal damnation or eternal bliss. Many of them are turning to some form of reincarnation or at least purgatory. Brother Stendhal Rast, quite a well-known monk, he says the myth of purgatory comes very close to the myth of reincarnation. It tries in general to answer the same questions, and it comes up with largely the same answers, that there is justice and that you have to work out your karma. So even if you've done bad things earlier, so in purgatory you can help improve yourself a little bit. For him, that's the idea of reincarnation, that next time you can come to a better state. I want to draw your attention to the idea of reincarnation as well as immortality of the soul are speaking about continuation of me in time. Whereas what all the great sages speak about is to come to a state of consciousness which is eternal and free of time sequence. I'm just quoting to you a remark from the Yoga Sutras. Sacred knowing, born of discernment, is liberating, comprehensive, eternal, and freed of time sequence. Sanskrit expression, if any of you want, is kraman, literally meaning time sequence, kraman. It's free of time sequence. This is why then I'm asking you to recall the remark of Christ. Before Abraham was, I am. But it makes no sense to the ordinary mind. The very next verse in the gospel is, so the very next verse is, then they pick up stones to throw at him. Also, I should maybe mention here, the idea of reincarnation was there very much in the Christian tradition also, until the 6th century. Emperor Justin, sometimes called Justinian, if you have seen this great building in the capital of Turkey, the building is called Hagia Sophia. It's like Hagia Sophia, but it's pronounced as Hagia Sophia, which basically really means sacred temple, essentially. It's actually an extraordinary building. Has anybody here seen this? Yeah? Don't you agree with me that it is extraordinary? Absolutely extraordinary. And in fact, when the emperor saw the building, I mean, he obviously didn't build it, but he was responsible for arranging its building. He said, Solomon, I have outdone you. Because Solomon is regarded as the maker of the first, or organizer of the first temple in the Jewish tradition. Solomon, I have outdone you. But he was very concerned about the idea of reincarnation, because actually I mentioned only yesterday when talking about from the perspective of reincarnation in the Indian tradition, depending on the quality of your life now, you could come to a lower level or at a higher level next life. But in general, people like to propose the idea that each time you come to a higher level. For example, in the Theosophical Society, as I mentioned this as an example, always the implication is that successive reincarnations you come to a higher level. I don't know what is guarantee for that, but that's the overall emphasis. Then, so this king was concerned that if people come closer and closer to God, why would they want a savior? Why would they come to the church? So he wanted this whole doctrine to be eliminated from Christianity. But the Pope at that time very much believed in reincarnation, and there was an earlier highly regarded Origen, a Greek church father in the 2nd century, very much believed in the idea of reincarnation. And then the Pope also believed it, so the king actually imprisoned the Pope and forced him to declare this idea heretical. So the Pope had no choice. This is why I keep saying there is so much combination in Christianity between the secular and the religious powers. So the Pope then declared this heretical, and Origen's books were burnt, and this whole idea eliminated from Christianity. Until the 6th century, the idea of reincarnation is very much there. And as I said, and this is not my remark, but the Encyclopedia Britannica says that this idea is gradually emerging back again, but not because of the doctrinal notion. It's not that the creeds are being changed or anything like this, but just because people find it difficult to accept permanently in hell or permanently in heaven. But the whole suggestion that a person who truly knows becomes free of time, as I have just quoted here from the Yoga Sutra, from the time sequence, that does not mean to be against time. This is the reason I earlier also mentioned this. The Buddha, when he is enlightened, it is said that he is free of time, but that does not mean that he is against time. He is also knowledgeable about past, present, and future. So he is nirkal, which means free of time, but also trikal darshi, seers of 3 times, past, present, and future. In fact, again and again I remind you, to be free of something does not mean to be against something, that you have to get rid of this. To be free of being driven by your ego doesn't mean that you have to be against the ego, to find its proper place. Repeatedly I keep coming back to this remark of my own teacher, Jean de Salman: ego is a good servant, but a bad master. There is no reason to be against the servant, but to allow it to become the master of the whole household will lead to trouble. Now, I strongly recommend, particularly those of you who, with almost everybody here other than maybe Guru and myself, have a Judeo-Christian background culturally, even though you may not regard yourself Jewish or Christian, but cultural background is very strong. And I recommend to you to read this particular entry in the Encyclopedia Britannica under the title Christianity, and then within that it's a very large writing, so then he's got different headings. So under that there is concepts of life after death. I especially recommend to you, and it's written by this character Jaroslav Ian Pelikan, professor of religion at Yale University. This is the American version of my book, The Yoga of the Christ, the Gospel of John in the Light of Indian Mysticism. Actually, nowadays they may not be so much against using the word yoga because it has become very popular. Because these days, yoga has, you probably know, is several $1 billion every year industry, yoga industry. Several billion. And most of the participants in the yoga practices, their family income is more than $100,000 a year. It's upper middle class which is participating in this. Yoga has not. It's really now, and mostly people undertake it to increase their sex appeal. That's what yoga seems to mean to them, basically. And sometimes you see pictures of some young, beautiful girl on the car, right on the front of it, trying to sell the car or a particular bank. Somehow, so yoga has now become a selling items of yoga. Certain yoga postures are selling them in one form or the other. Don't take my word for it. All you need to do is to go on Google, tell you everything. It's an omniscient. So, consider it seriously. We cannot not be influenced by our cultural, religious background. On the other hand, to be influenced by it does not mean that one cannot try to understand what the influences are and how can I be somewhat free of it. And that, in my judgment or in my practice, is more possible if one tries to be aware of other perspectives rather than just becoming either against it or that this is the only perspective about what happens after death. So to become aware of some other perspectives already brings a slightly different kind of feeling about it. At least it provides a possibility that there can be other perspectives about it. But then not to necessarily get stuck with the other perspectives. In fact, in my own, several of my friends have written to me after reading my book, etc., that now they feel more connected with Christianity than they did earlier. So I'm delighted about this. It's not that I'm trying to have them move away from Christianity. That would be silly. That's not why I'm writing. My own writing really has emerged. I wasn't trying to write or anything, but just because whenever I said to any of my friends what Christ has said, they were surprised that that's what Christ said. So I ended up writing this book, essentially really trying to understand the subtle teachings of Christ. And then, of course, one also has to read what some of the followers of Christ have been, those who actually practice, not those who just keep saying, I believe. That has nothing to do with it. There is a remark of Christ, actually this is in the Gospel of Philip. Maybe I should mention 2 or 3 remarks here. First of all, Gospel of Philip says, it is strange that people think a woman sired a child on a woman. Where this is coming from is Holy Spirit, that is Spiritus Sanctus in Latin, is masculine. And the overall emphasis is that Spiritus Sanctus sired the child on Mary. That she was virgin. This itself is crazy. Even in the ordinary standard canonical gospel, like Gospel of Mark, you can read people are talking about his older brother, James. So he already has an older brother, but a Virgin Mary is virgin. It's all taken so literal-mindedly. It's absolutely amazing to me. And similarly, Nicodemus, who comes to Christ, this is the 3rd chapter of John's Gospel. He's one of the members of the Jewish council, which ultimately actually condemns him to crucifixion. But he's not the one who condemns him. He actually comes and even takes care of his grave, of his corpse. Or tries to, but the corpse is missing, discovered. And that even when he's asked, Christ says to him, you have to be born again. It's amazing what he says. How can an old man like me re-enter the womb of his mother to be born again? This is how he understands being born again. Now, I find it just so absolutely amazing. Don't take my word for it. This 3rd chapter of John's Gospel. You can read, this is what he said. Or similarly, what virgin birth. Christ already has, or if you like, young child, Jesus already has older brother, older sister, but Virgin Mary. So this remark of Gospel of Philip, that it is strange that a woman sired a child on a woman, Latin version, Spiritus Sanctus, initially is being, every text in the New Testament was written in Greek. The word in Greek is pneuma, which is being translated as Spiritus Sanctus. Pneuma is neuter in Greek. You can ask any Greek scholar. And then even the Torah in the Roman Empire. Strangely, in the Roman Empire, the Torah was read in Greek, not in Latin, because even the Roman emperors very much admired the Greek language, actually. So when the Torah was read in Greek, what was being translated into pneuma was ruh or shekinah, two of the Hebrew words. Both of them are feminine. So it moves from feminine in Hebrew to neuter in English to masculine in Latin. Just to give you a very ordinary contemporary example, the moon in the Indian language, especially in Hindi, also in Sanskrit, is masculine. Very often a child would say Chanda Mama, moon, Uncle Moon. In English it is neuter. In French it's feminine. So what do? Attach a genitalia to the moon? No, I find this, but this is what goes on. This is the reason I am pointing out to you this remark in the Gospel of Philip, that it is strange that people should believe that a woman sired a child on a woman. What is meant by Virgin Mary is somebody who is completely undefiled by selfish desire, selfish needs. She's completely pure-hearted. That's a very different understanding of virgin. But another remark, again in the Gospel of Philip, is, this is a remark attributed to Christ. He who is near me is near the fire. He who is far from me is far from the kingdom. It's not so easy to practice all the things that Christ is inviting us to practice. Complete freedom from me. If you think it's easy, try it. He who is near me is near the fire. And it's not only Christ's remark. In standard Gospels, you read when the baptizer, James, what does he say? I am baptizing you with water, but he who is to come will baptize you with fire and spirit. This is right in the standard Gospel. Sometimes I keep asking my Christian friends, good idea to read the Gospels, even the standard ones. Okay, so let's take 15 minutes break. Then, as I have repeatedly said, then you can try to reform me. With fight is almost a standard requirement of humanity, it seems to me. It's sad, but it seems to be the case. If you look at the history, throughout history, sooner or later somebody will find the next door king is not a good guy, so I'm going to attack him. And then, of course, I'm going to take everything that he owns, etc. And because he's not a good guy, what is goodness according to my understanding? So this is what goes on.
So it's important not to get hooked into these things.
No, but on the other hand, at the same time, throughout human history, even during the greatest crisis, there have been some quite wise people doing their part. And everybody's radiation or their own vibrations influence the atmosphere around them. Somebody like the Buddha or Christ would have a much larger influence than I would have. But I see this even in my own case. If my attitude is a little free of something, it has slight effect on my friends, on my children, or even sometimes on my neighbors. So really what we need to do is our part. And some right vibrations will then emerge out of this. The word vibration may not appeal to you, some other expression if you like. The right energy will ooze out of you.
That's all we can do. That is all we can do.
That's all we can do. But greater the person, greater effect it has. But even there I often, in fact, we have, ancient sages are difficult to pin down what their character is. But contemporary ones, let's say Krishnamurti. Do you think the human condition really changed because of Krishnamurti?
No.
It's in, the humanity now is in a worse state than it was before he was born. But some people around him were influenced, and something in them changed. There is absolutely no question about that. But to imagine that Krishnamurti brought about a whole global change, one can say if you like, that's what people would say in one of their religions or the other. But if you look at it impartially, hardly the human situation is in a better shape now because of Krishnamurti, or similarly with Annie Besant or with HPB. These are great people. But their presence, sometimes their writings or sometimes what they say, sometimes just their presence has this vibrations and it changes something for some people.
So you could look at that and go, so what's the point, of any of this? But the only point that, for me, is that to live our purpose. And that's all we can do with no expectation and no need to change anything. Because,
And maybe we're too impatient. Maybe we expect the changes, big changes.
Quickly.
Yeah, and big changes take time, don't they? Well, I guess Krishnamurti could argue with us about that, but
No, none of us need to really argue. We are just trying to share something, some perspective.
I remember something that Krishnamurti said, which was that war is a projection of everyday life,
Yeah.
which brings it right down to individual action.
Yeah. No, I agree. And we can sometimes intellectually clearly understand that it's not a good idea to have wars. We can have very good ideas about it. But look at throughout human history. Every neighboring king is eager to attack the other neighboring king for some reason or the other. Sometimes maybe they are feeling attacked or they want to conquer something, or often just to rape their women. Or, there is all kinds of reasons that what forces are at play is really quite amazing to see. But this is true throughout human history. And then people whose king they are, they would regard him as a great king. I'm always so surprised when they say Alexander the Great. What's so great about him? He was a terrorist from the perspective of India. But from the perspective of the Western countries, it's Alexander the Great. Well, so this is how then they get uplifted in history books or this or that. And so then one can begin to admire them because they acquired larger empires. That's why they were great.
for what,
Yeah.
Now,
Yes, please. No, it's okay. You can speak.
this is getting a little bit pessimistic for me.
yeah.
I mean, is not evolution working towards a higher consciousness?
Overall in humanity or in one person or some people?
The whole picture of war after war, what Churchill's definition of history is just one damn war after another.
Which is true.
Which
Why do you
is true.
disagree with
So, I'm looking for a positive word about the process.
so that you don't have to do anything about it?
Joke.
No, I'm asking you. Why do you want a positive word rather than what is true? Why not to have what is true rather than positive or negative?
Well, I want to transcend the opposites, yes.
I see.
Yes.
Good luck to you. Wish you well.
Oh,
the key is acceptance.
Hmm?
The key is acceptance and living with that sadness and that grief. But is that acceptance if you feel sadness? Because then there is some kind of hope or expectation or, so versus just seeing it for what it is without feeling anything, because it is what it is.
I think St. Peter will ask me, what did you actually do? Whatever my expectations may be, but what did I actually do? Yes, you wanna?
I was like sort of telling this, I don't know if everybody has seen it.
Speak a little bit more loudly.
There was a wonderful film made of Passage to India, and you know, the English professor has a group of friends that are Indian, different caste, different, you know, levels of consciousness, whatever. And one of the people in this group is a Brahmin, who is played by a wonderful actor.
Alec Guinness.
Thank you. Yes, names, everything goes out of my head these days. And you know, the English professor, their friend is in jail, and they need to get him out, and you know, and so of course the English professor, being from Britain, is saying, well, we have to do something, and can we do this, can we do that? And the Brahmin, you know, looks him at one point and he says, yes, you can do that, but it will make no difference. and that goes around in my head all the time, as though this is the problem. Yes, if you come through the whole experience of getting involved with Eastern religions, and it takes you to a place where you just sit and do nothing because that's what it's told you, or you're in the British camp where you think you have to run in and change the world. What is the truth? But it was a wonderful scene, and I
Yes,
do remember
yes.
it.
In one of the films in India, there is a repeated remark that everything will be good at the end. And if it is not yet good, it is not the end. So it can keep you positively oriented. Yes.
Don't give up.
No, personally, my own impression is each one of us needs to do whatever we find useful to do, or what we think is useful to do, helpful to do. But more than external action, in my judgment, what is more helpful is one's own internal development, because that almost automatically influences the atmosphere around you. External action is not a bad thing to do, but there are also contrary actions taking place the whole time. But internal, we may use the word evolution, if you like. But what does that actually mean? In general, again, every linguistic expression has its difficulties, one can argue with it. But what is the call from the sages? To be more and more free of me, and to come to the level where they are. So whether then they say to come to become one with God, the Father and I are one. And then, of course, in the scholarly world, there is always naturally tendencies to argue. Is Christ saying the same thing as Yajnavalkya says? Christ says, the Father and I are one. Yajnavalkya said, I am Brahma. Now, personally, for me, something in me feels that they are really approaching the same level of reality. But I can't say that from my experience. But we have had, by the way, some of you probably know this, one very great sage in India called Ramakrishna. At the end of the 19th century, Vivekananda was one of his disciples. More people know about Vivekananda than they know about Ramakrishna. So that's why I'm mentioning it. Vivekananda was his disciple. Ramakrishna intentionally undertook to practice Christianity as well as Islam. These were the only two, as I quoted yesterday, from the perspective of the British census. There are only 3 religions in India. everybody who is an Indian who is not a Christian or a Muslim is a Hindu. So there are only Hinduism, Christianity and Islam. So Ramakrishna actually undertook the practices of, well, he was a Hindu by background, but he undertook Christian practice and Islamic practice, and actually concluded from his experience. He's the only one I know in human history who in fact actually has tried to relate with this in practice, that they lead to the same reality. But he also describes, for example, in the process of when he was practicing Islamic teachings, that on the way he also found himself trying to fight or argue with other people. That was part of the tradition, was somehow inviting him to do that. He didn't find this while he was practicing the Christian practices. So, but for me personally, I cannot say that from my personal experience that these are all leading to the same truth. But Ramakrishna seems to be the only person who actually tried to practice this and to come to that conclusion, which speaks to me as something more sensible. It's really simply saying different ladders can lead to the rooftop. It doesn't have to be just one ladder that goes there, which is what every religion somehow wants to claim, that that's the only ladder.
So what would the sages tell us? Living in all of this absurdity, distortion, injustice, what would the people from the sages from the Upanishads, the Gnostic Gospels, I mean, what would, if they had something to share with us, and you've said it probably, tell me, what would they say? We're facing all of this, we see all of this, and then there's this deeper need for the deeper development of ourselves. Well, what else would they share with us?
I think obviously I don't know, but my overall impression is what they are likely to say is to whatever can assist the quality of my own being, that is what I should do. And that requires, from their point of view, first of all, find more and more quietness of the mind, because mind is the one which is arguing one way or the other, something like that, and listen. So that's one thing. Secondly, to actually undertake certain practices which may even simply be, can I be, next time somebody offends me, can I truly forgive this person and not want to punish him or this or that. So there are many practices of that kind that, or for example, if I am accustomed to eating certain kind of food, can I intentionally see, can I be free of that for a day or 2 or 3? So, but because all of those practices are actually to see the strength of me, my mind. Everything gets driven by these very strong forces. What can I achieve by, even for example, the question you are raising, what can I achieve if I follow the teachings of the sages? So that already is my acquisition of something or my advancement. So to begin to see this more and more, how in every undertaking that I do, and then to intentionally take those practices which may gradually slightly free me of this. For example, if somebody who offends me, how can I not only simply forgive them, but even find some ways of finding something about them that will allow me to love them? Now, that's easier said than, let me tell you. All practices are easier to articulate, but not so easy to practice. Similarly, then, another thing which is sometimes gets more emphasized than at other times by different people, that my mind can understand something or decide something, but the body is not willing to carry it out. Look at your New Year's resolutions. Then very strong suggestion to find practices that will coordinate the body and the mind and the emotions. Now, so I think different teachings then end up emphasizing slightly different things to try. But since you're asking what is it the sages would say, but overall what is behind all this, whatever practice one is trying, what is behind it, how can I enhance the quality of my being? What does that mean? More compassion, more love, more sense of service, more freedom from my acquisition, my advancement, my desire, to become increasingly an instrument of the divine will. All this is easier said than done, but even to say that, to be clear about that, can free sometimes something that I usually try or don't do. Now, of course, different teachings would emphasize, this is actually an analogy given by an old friend of mine. You probably know his name, Jacob Needleman, gave this example, that if many people were trying to go to the White House, obviously he was an American, so he gives this example trying to go to the White House. But if somebody is coming from the Sahara Desert, naturally he will start on the camel. If somebody is coming from the Pacific Ocean, they will start in a boat. And if somebody is coming from Canada, they might come in a car. But closer they come to the White House, their clothing will be similar, their vehicles will be similar, but initially, particularly, all the teachings tend to be quite different from each other. I give you a very simple example. For example, in the Krishnamurti circles, generally speaking, it's not considered a good, or even the Theosophical circle, it's not considered a good idea to have alcohol or meat. But there is no such forbidden thing, anything in the Gurdjieff circles, as an example. I mentioned this. But on the other hand, I even asked Krishnamurti on one occasion, why are you so gung-ho against alcohol? Have you actually tried it? He says, yes, I have tried it. And then, if you don't mind, I give you a particular example. This was in 1981. I had attended a conference, and actually I was chairing that conference in Hawaii. 2 or 3 Nobel Prize winners were people in that conference. In fact, my wife even said, it was like riding the herd of lions that I had to control. Imagine having these Nobel Prize winners in the people that you're trying to control, to say something, speaking different languages, etc. In any case, on the way back, I had to stay overnight in Los Angeles. Coming from Hawaii to go to Halifax, you realize, and staying overnight in Los Angeles. And Krishnamurti on more than one occasion has said to me, whenever it is possible, please come and see me. So I wasn't sure whether he was at that time in Ojai or not Ojai. So I phoned Mary Zimbalist. You probably all know Mary Zimbalist was more or less his, sometimes I say she was like his nanny for many years, or his caretaker or his secretary, whatever phrase appeals to you. But for several years, she really took care of him very much. And so she said to me, yes, he is here, but he's exhausted. He's been giving 3 or 4 days public talks. And as you know, Krishnamurti always spoke with great passion. This is obviously true. And that she was very unsure whether I should really come to see him. But then she says, but I know he'll be very happy to see you. But promise you won't raise anything serious. So I promised that I won't raise anything serious. So I come there with my wife. We both come there. And at lunchtime, I'm sitting on his left side, Mary Zimbalist is on his right side, and my wife is sitting on the other side of the table. For some reason, he was already in 1981, he would have been about, I think, 86 years old, so he was not young. He was not eating very much. Throughout his lunch, he kept holding my right hand. And coming from India, I'm not accustomed to eating with my left hand. That is considered rather strange in India, to be eating with one's left hand. but there I was. Throughout lunch, he kept holding my right hand. But in any case, and whenever anything came to my mind, then I would change immediately, say, "You Krishna, nice weather outside, maybe we'll go," trying to be just as superficial as I can manage. But then I don't know exactly what happened. Suddenly something emerged from me without I said, "Krishnaji, it seems to me that every impression changes our body at a cellular level." He looked at me, he says, "Sir, should we go into it?" Mary Zimbalist looks at me with dragon eyes. I have clearly betrayed my promise. And I tried to say, "Krishnaji, well, I'm not feeling very well. I'm feeling tired. Maybe after lunch we'll go for a walk." No, this is important. So he sent somebody to bring a recorder. This is all going to be recorded. We have to go into this. And in fact, I have seen him do it. I would even say I was surprised that a person at a high level of wisdom could come with that attitude. He was mad as hell at Mary Zimbalist because he wanted for him to rest. She said, "Shut up," very strongly. This is what he said to Mary Zimbalist. "Shut up. This is important. We have to go in." So I'm feeling so bad because I have obviously betrayed my... Now, did I betray or something in me betrayed or the devil in me? I have no idea, but somehow this expression came out. So there we were, having this conversation. So afterwards, I was feeling so bad that I immediately left Ojai. I had to actually rent a place in Los Angeles for overnight. It even cost me money. So 3 days later, phone rings in Halifax. I described this in my book, actually, this very incident. And 3 days later, so my wife says the voice sounds familiar, but he's speaking very formally. "May I speak to Professor Ravindra?" Nobody calls me like that in Canada. It's a very different kind of attitude. And so it's Krishnamurti on the phone. Where the hell he got my phone number? Why wouldn't he have somebody else call me and then give him the phone? I have no idea, but it's Krishnamurti. This is what he said. "What you had said 3 days ago, I have been thinking about it." This is the man who says everything happens instantaneously. "What you said 3 days ago, I have been thinking about it. Can you come and see me for half an hour?" Now I'm 4,000 miles away. But this is Krishnamurti. And then next week, I had another conference in London, England. Now, you have to take my word for it. I flew to London, England from Halifax via Los Angeles. Because, in a way, it is also true. An iron needle has no choice but to be drawn to the magnet. I could hardly say no to him. So I came. And then the reason I was telling you this story, first of all, we had a long conversation. I had actually earlier, several years earlier, on the invitation of somebody, had written a little, as it were, it was an article, but like a letter to Krishnamurti. And I was sure that he hasn't read it. I mean, people were always sending him many letters, etc. So he asked me many questions, wanted me to do something for his foundation, or actually take charge of the foundation, if you'll be surprised to hear this. But I was not keen to do any of this, because I was always concerned his attitude towards all the teachings and the teachers. I said, I have been very much helped by my teachers. Why should I therefore say I don't need a teacher? That I said, yourself, you may not think you are a teacher, but that's what people think you are. And at least I think you are a teacher. I was quite frankly with him. But in any case, I wasn't so keen. So I gave him this letter that I had written earlier. And he said he'll read it and we'll speak about it tomorrow. And the end of that letter was that I can understand there is no way from here to there, but is there a way from there to here? Next morning, people don't believe any of this, he actually made breakfast for me. We had breakfast together. And this is why I tell people, my vegetarian friends in India don't eat eggs. But Krishnamurti actually made eggs, omelette for me, for himself. So we had breakfast together. And he said, that last remark in your letter, that's what I've been telling all my last 60 years. And he says, people, especially the scientists, are unable to hear it. This is his remark. Especially the scientists are unable to hear it. That there is no way from here to there, but there is a way from there to here, which is what he's trying to bring. So, in any case, I'm giving you all this background. And then, because I was now invited by Krishnamurti, this is the afternoon when I came, the people who were in charge, I've forgotten their names, they were from Sweden. Mr. and Mrs. In any case, they invited me for dinner and served me wine.
Erna Liliefeld. Erna Liliefeld.
That's right. That's right.
Erna Liliefeld.
Yeah. And then they're serving me dinner with nice red wine. Now, you are not supposed to have wine in the Krishnamurti circles. That was the reason I was telling you this story. That there is always, now because they are entertaining me, treating me as a guest, they're so serving me wine. So one can get too attached to any of these things. Every teaching, especially in the beginning circles, has very different attitude, different clothes. The kind of clothing that the Buddhist monks wear are different from what the Christian monks wear. But now I can assure you, you can look at it actually in California, even the Zen monks wear jeans. So don't get so attached to what takes place in any teaching. In the beginning, they are different from each other, different languages, different emphasis, different attitudes. But closer they come to any kind of truth, they're very much closer to each other. Jean de Salzman, my teacher in the Gurdjieff teaching, was a very great admirer of Krishnamurti. She actually even said, we often spoke about this. She said, oh yes, there is no question Krishnamurti has being, you can see this, but what Gurdjieff brought was a science of being. How do you relate with this? Because Krishnamurti always keeps saying there is no way. Somehow it gets so emphasized, although he's actually indicating many ways himself. He often speaks about, for example, impartial self-knowledge or self-study. That's one of the ways. He so much emphasizes it, but then he keeps saying there is no way. So in the Gurdjieff teaching, there is very much an emphasis on the way. Trying this, trying that. How do you bring your mind and body and feelings together? And how do you relate with subtler centers, higher mind, etc. So there is very strong emphasis on meditation, on discussion of ideas, trying various things, interacting with each other searcher, etc. Many things. But I mean, I don't want to go into the details of this. If you're at all interested, you can read my book, Heart Without Measure, where I try to, mostly I'm just quoting what Madame de Salzman said to me. When I thought of writing about it, this is after her death, the only title that came to my mind was Heart Without Measure. Because in my personal experience, I have never met a person who combined so much wisdom and so much love as she did. And I seem to have met her hundreds of times. None of my people in the Gurdjieff teaching can possibly believe it, that I had so many meetings with her, at least 100 meetings with her. Mostly private, but some in some group meetings. In fact, her instruction was, when I went to Paris every year for 5 or 6 weeks, for 10 years, that I had to call her every day and then she could tell me when I could come. On one occasion, I was feeling, believe it or not, I was feeling rather good about it, that I knew she was busy as hell. This was obvious. And she was not young. When I started meeting with her, which was in 1980, she was 91 years old at that time, hardly a young woman. She died at 101, so I worked with her for about 10 years. So on one day, I decided not to phone her, thinking I should not bother her. Next day, she gave me hell. She says, I have the freedom to say no. You must call. So then I had no freedom after that. I had to call her every day, even if she was busy as hell or whatever. So I'm just telling you, different teachers have slightly different attitudes maybe, or different ways, but different teachings, especially in the beginning. So don't be against any teaching. That's my general call. But one cannot climb to the roof on 2 ladders at once. One needs to seriously undertake the practice of a teaching and to see if I can, but without therefore imagining that no other teaching can take somebody to the rooftop. Why not? And personally, without my even trying, I'm just absolutely amazed how I ended up meeting 2 absolutely remarkable Zen masters. I wasn't looking for them, but one of them I had absolutely never heard of. And nobody was arranging this, but what forces arranged us to get there? If you're interested, I can tell you all these stories. I mean, I write some of these stories in that book. But maybe the other one, this was Roshi Kabori, head of Rinzai Zen for 2 decades, hardly a negligible Roshi. I was actually in Japan in some other context, something to do with setting up what ended up being a special kind of reward for integral studies. I was the founding director of that reward. That has its own history. I don't want to get into that. But in any case, I was in Japan and I had heard about his name. I wanted to meet him. So one of the well-known businessmen in Japan was trying to be helpful to me. He said, you know, Roshi Kabori doesn't speak English, so I will speak to him on your behalf. And then he called me to say that Roshi Kabori can't see me. There is a sesshin. Sesshin is a Japanese word, meaning it's like a 5 or 6 day gathering of people undertaking meditation. A sesshin is taking place in his monastery, and he can't invite you to visit him, etc. So I was rather saddened. But hardly half an hour or even less than after he called me, I got a phone call in my hotel from Roshi Kabori himself, speaking in English, which this guy said he doesn't speak English. Hell of a lot better English he had than my Japanese, I can assure you that. He said, I have heard that you want to see me. I said, yes. He said, we are having a sesshin here, so I can't invite you here, but I can come to your hotel. Now this is Roshi Kabori, so he comes to my hotel. And then he says, I hear that you are interested in Zazen. Zazen simply means sitting. I said, yes, show me. Now there is no cushion or anything like this. So I just pick up the pillow from the bed and I sit there in full lotus position. He looks at me, he says, from the land of the Buddha. He says, I have never allowed anybody to come in the middle of the sesshin, but if you wish to come, tomorrow is the 4th day, you're welcome to come. So there I am. So then I met with him. So I described some of these things in the book. Now, how should I meet him? Why should I meet him? And then when he discovered that I had met Krishnamurti, he said, I have read only one book. This is a book by Krishnamurti, in which every word is true. He had never met Krishnamurti or heard him. I have read only one book in my life in which every word is true. And so then, being a little difficult party, I said, does that apply to all the Buddhist books also? He says, yes. He agreed that even among all the standard Buddhist books, he would say. And then when he discovered that I also had met Jeanne de Salzman, he said, she is the most remarkable person I have ever encountered. This is Roshi Kabori. So then, of course, that brought us even closer to each other because I had already met some of these other remarkable people. So since then, I have met him many, many times. At one stage, he wanted me to come and take charge of his monastery, if you can possibly believe this. I can't believe any of this myself. This is absolutely, I don't know a single word of Japanese, but that's my life. So really what is required, you were asking what can we do. What we is required from our side is internal evolution. It has certain requirements. You need to practice this, practice that, etc. But that depends on what kind of teaching assists you. Not to be against any teaching. Anybody seriously practicing anything needs to be admired. Even my own children have difficulty quite believing in any of these things, but then they finally end up encountering these characters themselves. Roshi Kabori, for example, my daughter came with me later on. I met him many times afterwards, and she came with me. And first of all, before she had come, on one occasion Roshi Kabori said to me, I said, my daughter is just graduating from school. She doesn't want to study or anything else until she grows up. He said, give her my phone number. I like to see her. So I said, please give me your... He had no idea what his phone number is. He had to get up to find out what his phone number. So he could give me his phone number, so which I could give to my daughter. And okay, I think we shall... I have many stories to tell you, but more importantly, really, to look at your own life. Many, many mysteries are running everybody's life. Why should you be born in the USA rather than China? Did you decide it? What forces are at play? And who you encountered? Why should you ended up joining the Theosophical Society rather than becoming a jihadi of killing other infidels? What forces are at play? I really invite you to think seriously. There are so many mysteries are running everybody's life, not only my life. And then one begins to see that it is stupid to imagine that the universe is centered around me. It's a very large universe, 2 trillion galaxies. But these forces are very, very conscious and aware. So it's not all just random. Even destruction, how can there be any kind of a system without occasional destruction? Even every car, every phone system, unless it falls down or breaks down, you can't just stay sticking with it forever. Every system, destruction is the necessity of construction. They need to go on.